Well, hello, everybody. We are going to be learning about soils from Mr. Jacob. How do you pronounce the last name? Eickstead?
Eickstead, yes.
Eickstead, okay. He got his master's, and I believe in soil studies from Texas A&M. Am I correct?
Yes, correct.
Okay. And he's currently working for the city of Austin as an environmental specialist, but he kind of got bit by the bug, if you will, after taking a course on soil science. And it's been a 9-year journey to this point. So I will let him take over from here. And there you go.
Everybody, you see my screen, right? It's on there.
You can also do a thumbs up in the chat or something if that works. If that works better.
Okay, so you can say hi. Hello, everyone. I'm Jacob Eickstead. Just so you know, I am a local. I actually am from Helotes. I grew up in Helotes. My parents are teachers. My mom is on her third to last day of teaching after 41 years. So I'm excited to talk to you about it. So in this slide here, you can see the soils of Bexar County. Of course, the San Antonio area could be more than this. All of y'all who live in Bexar County, of course, know that on the north part of this soil, or this county, we have really rocky soils, right? And on the south part, we have really deep prairie soils. While we'll find almost all of the same plants in one area to the other, there's definitely a difference. You know, you're going to see a lot in the deeper soils. Those grasses are going to be probably more tall grasses, right? Or they're going to be much more established, especially if they're native and they're supposed to be there and they're functioning as designed. But if they're if you're in the north part of the area, those tall grasses, they're really only going to survive in the areas where there's a lot of water, where there's, you know, where bottom of the bottomland areas, and they're not going to do so well. Those tall grasses aren't going to do as well on the top. So, you know, that is a product of the soils that exist in Bexar County. If nobody has used it, I recommend you go on Web Soil Survey and find your area. So you can make little squares, your area of interest, and then you can click on the soil map, and you can kind of get an idea of what your soil is. So here is actually an Austin photo, because I give this talk in San Antonio and Austin. So forgive me. I bounce between the two of you guys, and sometimes one gets into the other. There's nothing wrong with Austin. It's just their tacos aren't as good as San Antonio. So here you can see an Austin silty clay, right? You have an Austin white, right? You have all these different clays. Well, what do these soils mean? Well, a lot of times what I'll do is I'll actually just Google the soil series, Austin soil series, and I kind of get myself little, like if I did that right now, and see what I get, and I happen to have looked this up recently, I'm going to get I gotta spell it correctly, official soil series classification. I'm going to get a fine, silty, carbonatic, thermic, eutothentic haplooustol. Now, I don't expect you to know what that means. But what I really want to know, what's really important, that haplooustol, the all means I have a mollisol, which means I have the most productive soil type in the world. If you're farming, or if you're wanting to grow native grasses, that all part, that mollisol, means I have a grassland prairie soil. Perfect for what we're talking about today, right? Well, the cool thing that you can see if you look in that and you look at is it'll actually have uses, crops, and then it has what are the native grasses that grow in it. Well, we have the big three as we talk about in Texas: little blue stem, Indian grass, Cytodes grama. Well, that's great. If we've got those, we've got mainly gramas and buffalo grass. Those are great grasses for native grass prairies. We don't have big blue stem, probably don't have the rain for big blue stem. We probably don't have the rain for Indian grass, but we're probably going to get or not Indian grass, I'm sorry, switchgrass. But we probably will get some switchgrass in there if we plant it in the good years, right? So what does soil do? Soil has many functions. It has lots of biology that's involved with it. It has, in this talk, we're going to talk about what it's composed of and how we're going to classify it. So its functions: makes food, right? Well, we're talking native grasses. What food are we going to get from it? Well, you guys know as well, there are native foods that we could eat, from Turk's cap to mesquite beans have all of a sudden become popular. Everybody's making them into flour for their paleo diet. But set that aside for what humans can get from that soil. What are animals getting from it? Well, if we have a mollisol, we have deep, rich soil. Every gram of soil, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in the biology part when we talk, every gram of soil has anywhere between 6 million and 3 billion microorganisms in it. That's a lot of microorganisms. And that's one gram of soil. Extrapolate that out into an acre of soil, right? If you have 1 inch tall grass, you don't have a lot of organic matter and your roots are only probably about 1 inch. You have 6 foot tall grass, you guys know as well as anybody, what do I have below that grass? I've got 6 to 12 feet of roots in there, which means I've got channels for water to go down to, and I got places for animals to live. Bacteria can live anywhere in there. I've got all kinds of things that soil is doing. And that is food for microorganisms. Those roots are the big provider of food for those microorganisms. And soil is like, it's the medium in which it all happens. And so it's a dynamic system. It absorbs like a sponge. It provides water. As the plant pulls water from the macropores, it starts coming out of the micropores until it runs out of water. And then, of course, we hit the wilting point. But it has nutrients, water, and air. It filters, so it's a purification process. It traps and it stores things, whether those are things that we want, like nutrients that get trapped inside of a clay or get trapped inside of an organic molecule of some kind and then get broken down by bacteria and released into the soil again, or pollutants that can get trapped, hopefully broken down, or at least trapped and stored and locked together. That's the goal, hopefully, with the pollutant. That's hopefully what happens. So typically when we talk about soils, we have 5 soil forming factors, right? We have climate, we have organisms, we have topography, which is relief, the parent material, which if you're talking San Antonio, anywhere in that area, the parent material is going to be limestone, 9 out of 10 times. Not always, pretty much usually limestone. And of course, time. Most of our soils are very young. They haven't been here very long, which means that they're pretty good soils. They're established enough that they've got these horizons, the A, the B, and the C horizons. There's young soils that don't have that. That might be in a mountain or they might be in a river. And so they haven't developed those horizons. But, when you have a mollisol, you've got a young soil that still has its nutrients haven't been washed out, but it is old enough that it has established its horizons. So climate has a huge factor in biodiversity, types of soils that we have. In Texas, what do we have? We have a rainy East Texas and we have a dry West Texas, and we're right there in the middle. You can see it. So San Antonio area, you get somewhere between maybe 30 inches of rainfall a year, and you know, on the west side of town, it might be less, might be 26 inches, you know, and then of course varies by years. There were years that I've lived in San Antonio where we got 56 inches in Helotes. It doesn't make us a rainforest, but there's other years that we got 15 inches. So it all kind of averages out, right? It's the year that you get a hurricane comes through or something like that. But you can see, you know, that as you go west in Texas, obviously you get much drier, and we all know this. And you go further north, it can be, it can vary. It's usually obviously drier the further west you go north, but you know, you change in elevation as well. You can get mountains. You go far enough west, you get very, very flat prairies. If you go far enough north, you get very flat prairies. You go far enough south, right? So all of this has a factor on what kind of climate we get. Parent material. This photo was taken in Helotes, actually, by my friend John. You can see what's the parent material here, right? Limestone. It influences our texture, influences the chemistry of the soil, the matrix, how that soil is, whether it's, you know, granular or if it's platy soils. So this one is gonna, obviously the rocks in this situation are pretty either massive, which means they're big and have no structure, or they're platy. And you know, that just depends on the soil structure, right? So more mica like soil is going to be more platy because mica is very platy. Granite's going to be very granular because it breaks down into more of a grain. So you go to the Llano River, you get very granular sands. And of course we have relief, big changes. In Helotes, where I'm from, I'm at the bottom of a hill, which means it's relatively deep, but it's at the bottom of the hill country. So my parents' front yard is probably 3 feet deep of soil. Great. Go to the backyard where I'm actually trying to grow my own little native prairie at about 1/4 of an acre, and I've got 6 inches of soil. That's it. That's what I have to work with, is 6 inches, because it slopes up. And I'm thankful for it, but that's what I got. So here's older soils, right? They're more weathered. I talked about that earlier. So this one on our right, that's an oxisol. That's in Puerto Rico. That's a soil that has weathered so much that even its clays have been washed out of the soil profile. Its nutrients are washed out of the soil profile. So the only thing that's really cycling nutrient-wise is those top 2-3 inches, or the leaf litter that's above it in this case. There's no nutrients below that. So it's all within that A horizon. And it gets washed out quickly. We don't see oxisols in Texas. They just don't exist because we don't get enough rainfall. We do have ultisols, which are the next one down. Here's thyme, man-made thyme. You know, this is a coal mine that has to be reclaimed. You know, but here we have a quick chaining soil. Different in the city or maybe in your house, but you know, if you're removing a soil, you take a topsoil and you put it in a pile, it stops functioning as a topsoil during that time. You know, and you spread it back out. You have to plant grasses, you can get it back to function as a topsoil, but you can lose some of those nutrients through the microbial processes of storing it in piles. So we'll just move past it. That's just kind of my old life there. But soil biology. So here's just some small examples of the biology you find in a soil. Bacteria, mycetes, fungi, protozoa, algae, arthropods, worms, reptiles, mammals, you know, obviously plants. All these things can be found in Bexar County. There's nothing that wouldn't, you know, that you wouldn't find in Bexar County. We have our macro animals or macro invertebrates would be like ants. You know, it's considered macro in the world of microorganisms because you can see an ant, right? And then you have, of course, macro vertebrates like mice that will dig tunnels through the soils. Things like horned lizard, not a lizard, but horned lizard that, or horny toad, which is a lizard, sorry, has, you know, it prefers sandy soils because it can quickly dig down it. So where are you going to find a horned lizard? If you do find one in Bear County, you'll find it, and they do exist in Bear County, I know they do. You'll find it in South area where we have really sandy soils. Later on in this presentation, by the way, I'm going to defend clay soils. I think they serve a really important purpose in what we do. So what do microbes do? They cycle nutrients. They suppress diseases. They degrade pollutants. Almost all of our antibiotics, something that seems, well, we're not fighting a bacteria, which is what you use antibiotics for, but it seems apt at this moment, right? Almost all of our antibiotics come from soil microorganisms. They also, and they form the glue that stabilizes the soil. So the organic matter in the soil holds each one of those individual soil particles together, and it's glomalin is what it's calling it. It'll actually glue them together. But unlike a compacted soil, you know, which it helps with that as well, is, you know, that glue can come apart, can go together, be used by plants. They also have symbiotic relationships. I think most of us know about, of course, the legumes in our soils and the rhizobium bacteria. You know, we have, you talked about red buds before we were on the call. The red buds are an incredibly important legume that we have in our soils. Obviously, mesquite trees, Wasatch. We have a semi-tropical environment in some ways, and so semi-tropical meaning close, you know, temperate, meaning we have the heat, right? Well, a lot of those legumes come up from tropical environments. If you were to go to the tropics, what would you find most of the time? Most of the time, you would find legumes. Almost all of the rainforest trees are actually legume trees, and you know, we actually get a lot of that here coming up that they've adapted to our areas. So, like I talked about, fungi, they form this glomalin glue. They also help plants actually spread out their roots. If you ever listened to This American Life, trees can actually shuttle nutrients to other trees that are hurting or injured. And it's this network that they move through these mycorrhizal fungi and these symbiotic relationships. So you got both rhizobium bacteria that are helping legumes fix nitrogen so that they can use nitrogen from the atmosphere. And you have these mycorrhizal fungi, which are able to get into these small areas of the soils and extract phosphorus and potassium that the plants can't reach, but they have this symbiotic relationship where they get the starches and the sugars from the plant, and they give the plant the other nutrients. And of course, you know, Navaceto lady stress is an excellent example of a native plant, not to Texas, or to Texas, yes, but not to central Texas, to College Station area. But that has a mycorrhizal fungi symbiotic relationship. Well, basically all of our orchids have that. So if you have an orchid on your land, and look carefully, you probably do, it will be surviving off of a mycorrhizal relationship. But plants, they're a huge source of nutrients for everything around them, not just the fungi, those actinomycetes, everything we talked about. Because putting a root through a soil is like us walking through a room that's filled with bowling balls with razor blades on the side. I mean, they force this root through, and it's just shedding cells as it goes. And the more it sheds, the more that bacteria, they break down those cells, they use it, and you end up with this rhizome situation where you have just tons of bacteria and tons of life that's immediately surrounding the root. So of course, when we talk about topsoil, this is where most of the organic matter happens. Most of the biological activity happens. My first job out of college, I was mapping soils in California, and we used to tell the people, they'd want to map the soils down to 4 feet, and they'd want to do all this stuff for the vines, and we're trying to convince them that manage for the first 6 inches. 90% of all the roots for that vine, that grapevine, are in the top 6 inches of the soil. Well, that's true of any plant. That's true of a live oak. They anchor down, but still 90% of those roots are in those top 6 inches, because that's where all the good stuff is. So that's where they're putting all their roots. They need to find water, or they need to do all that other stuff. That's absolutely true, but they need to get nutrients too. So management is managing the soils you have based on the properties of those soils, right? So we talked about this little prairie I have in Helotes. What on my face? I have an Eccrine Clay. I showed you a photo of that Eccrine Clay earlier, right? That photo my friend John took, it was, 6 inches of soil, maybe an inch, and they had road cut, and it was just a massive block of limestone below that. That's what I'm dealing with. That's what's there. I mean, I got 6 inches. It's a little less rocky than that. That's extremely rocky, but it's the same type of soil, 6 inches, and then it is a block of limestone from there to the aquifer, and including the aquifer. And that 6 inches of soil is where all my nutrients and all my roots are going. You know what, though? In those 6 inches of soil, I have a mollisol. I have the most productive soil in the world. I just only have 6 inches of it. So that soil took millions of years to form. You're not going to change it overnight. I didn't get many native grasses till 3 years in. This was an old horse pasture, so there's compaction to deal with. There's lots of weeds. Just getting rid of the ligustrum helped significantly. But in the end, I'm going to get the plants that are capable of growing there. I may get a redbud to take. I can definitely get a mesquite tree to take, but I'm not going to get a magnolia tree. That's just not going to happen. I've tried it. I'm not going to get switchgrass. I might get lucky this year, had some good rain. There might be a few that are going to pop up, but I can get a ton of gamma grass. I can get little blue stem in there, and I can get buffalo grass, and the buffalo grass grows wonderfully. And more than anything, I can get a few of those really nice flowers that we all want. So not every soil is going to be able to, and not every environment is going to be able to provide what you want. At the same time, I always make the point that outside of my window, or even my parents' house, you look at the fauna that's supposed to be growing there. It's mostly live oak, prairie savanna, live oaks, little blue stem, buffalo grass, all those things. And a lot of these plants, when you look at people's descriptions, they'll almost always say they love a well-drained soil. There's hardly any well-drained soils in Bexar County. So how are they doing this well? They're growing everywhere, aren't they? But I push against that, because I feel that they love their native environment. If they get a well-drained soil, they probably do better. But they can do really well in a clay soil too. And it's the down years when we're not getting as much water. If you stay off of it and you let that grass grow, you'll notice some of those clay soils will still manage to give you native stands of grass, and the sandy soils will not as well. And in the good years, it's the opposite. So it's managing for the soil you have, right? So how do you get soil health? You minimize soil erosion. How do you do that? You keep plants on it. You maximize organic matter productivity. How do you do that? You keep plants on it, you let them grow tall. Maximize soil microbial population diversity. Keep plants on it, native plants, diverse selection, let them grow tall. Maximize water infiltration and percolation. Stay off of it when it's wet. So don't be running equipment or trucks or whatever on it when it's wet. Keep plants on it, diverse plants, let them grow tall. There's a theme here. Minimize compaction, same thing. Let them grow tall. All right, so you do more by doing less, right? So you can be patient, wait for your native grasses to grow. You get a living root. That root will do more for you than any amendment that you can add to the soil. You know, I always say the best way to establish native grasses that I have seen is not letting it bake in the sun. So put the seed down at the right time, cover it with some sort of mulch, be that hay or not Bermuda grass hay, because it will seed. Some other type of hay. Native grass hay is the best, but you could also do alfalfa hay will do pretty well too, because alfalfa usually will not seed, and if it does seed, alfalfa will not succeed. It will die in our soils. So putting some sort of mulch cover on top, and giving it water at the right time, or hoping the water happens, and being patient. Giving a soil as much cover as possible gives you the most success. So what are they made of? Well, texture-wise, they're sand, silt, and clay. Sand just means the bigger particles. This is a beach ball. This is a baseball. This is a clay aspirin tablet. So that kind of gives you an idea. Let's go past this part of what a soil is like. You know, and honestly, this is one thing people don't quite understand. If you were to remove all of the water in a clay soil, it would actually be lighter than a sandy soil. Sandy soil has really big particles, you know, the beach balls, if you will. So if I filled this room with beach balls and I filled this room with aspirin tablets, but I didn't have any water in here, there would be more air in the aspirin tablet room, because there's much smaller pores, but there's much more of them. So the sandy soils, if they're actually filled with the same amount of water, they're actually heavier. The clayey soils, we think of them as heavy soils, ironically, because they're actually lighter if you remove the water, but they hold onto the water really well. So how, you know, if we look at the composition of a soil, most of a soil is pore space. Half of it is air, half of it is water. In a rain event, that water can go up to 50%, and the air goes down to 0, and flip-flop in between. So, you know, drought event, it'll never go down to 0, but your water can go down to much lower. Organic matter, 5% is never going to happen. Okay, maybe you guys can get it up to 3% in ideal conditions. That would be the native conditions, but very, very, very difficult to get it up to 5%. And I would argue most of the time when people say, well, mine's up to 5%, I would ask, when did you last apply compost? Because organic matter is fickle and it goes up and down, but if you leave it be and cycle on its own, organic matter will only be 5%, typically in the Midwest. And then the rest is a mineral portion. Silicas, iron, aluminum, calcium carbonate, that would be limestone. That's a lot of ours. Most of the mineral portion is silica. So soil scientists are kind of like biologists in that they classify things. They classify how soils are thought of. So if you look at the biology of the kingdom, division, class, order, family, genus, species. Soils, you have order, suborder, great group, subgroup, family, series, and phase. There's 12 orders, and I'll go through them in a little bit, not in detail, but just kind of giving you an idea. Each of these things mean something. So smectitic means that that's the type of clay. Thermic means that's the temperature which this soil is formed. Fine means that it's a clayey soil. And vertisol, which we'll talk about, meaning that, sorry, my dog's barking, is those shrink swell clays. And you'll see those a lot in Texas. You'll see that often in the southeast side of San Antonio. And so this is a shrink swell clay. If you do there's a Soils app, and if you click find my soil, and Houston Black comes up, and you have your house built on it, I'm willing to bet you have a crack in that house somewhere. That's the one that shrinks and swells. So as you can see, some soils, they differ in how they're formed. And so when you're on the bottom of a bottomland, you don't have as much of those layers haven't developed as well. There's not the A, B, and C, because you get new soil being deposited every day, right, by the river. You get a little bit further upland, you get those soils that have developed nicely. You go even to the top of the hill, though, you get a lot of erosion, right? So you'll have a lot of those soils that have eroded away, and they might not have their layers as well developed. So here are 12 orders of soil, and I'll go through them kind of quickly just so you have an idea of what they are. So there's alpha soil, and that's like our trees. So you see that a lot more in East Texas. There are alpha soils in Bexar County, though. They're good productive soils. They're just kind of like the mollisol over here, just a little less productive, meaning they're a little bit older. They've had some of the nutrients wash out. Andisols, which are volcanic soils, we do not have those here. Aridisols, which are desert soils. Intisols, which are newly formed soils, like maybe a river bottom. Gelisols, which are frozen soils, like you'd find in Alaska. We do not have those here. Histosols, which are organic soils, like you'd find in a swamp or a peat in like far east of here. Maybe you'd find that in Louisiana. You find it often like Michigan areas. Really organic soils, we do not have those in Bexar County. Inceptisols, we do have those. Those are kind of like an intisol, but they're just a little bit more developed. Mollisols, that's the one we've been talking about. That's the prairie soils. That's the one everybody wants to have if you bought a farm, right? Or if you have a prairie and you're trying to get native grasses. Mollisols are what you want. Oxasols are rainforest soils. Spodosols are really interesting soils as a soil scientist, but they're really weathered. They're really acidic soils that form more in like Canada and those areas in the eastern United States with a lot of rainfall. So we don't see those. They don't really exist in Texas. There's one teeny little spot where they exist. Then there's ultisols, which we do have in East Texas. Those are the dark red soils that they talk about in Georgia, and you'll see them in East Texas as well. Sometimes you may think that you have an ultisol because it's dark and red, like if you go to Abilene, but that's an alpha sol with a lot of iron in it, and that's why it's really red. An ultisol is just a really weathered soil. And then we have vertisols. We have a lot of those. That was like that Houston Black. And those are the shrink swell clays. You don't want to build a house on it. And if you do, it's fine. You know, we have ways to stabilize them now, but they are wonderful for prairies. They're really, really productive soils for native grasses. So that's really the great part about vertisoils. And you can tell they all have kind of a name. You know, where did they come from? Aridus means, you know, dry. Septum means beginning. Mollisol means soft and soft soil. So they all have a meaning. That's, you know, the purpose behind those names. All right, so this is kind of the meat of what I'm trying to talk. So this is the general soils of Texas. You can see Bexar County there. You can see you've got that yellow stripe coming to it where it's got Houston black, like I talked about earlier. It's also got this white one, the Gulf Coast Prairie on the south. Going back. Dang it. This part, I want to go back to this and play it. And so it should come up here in a second. So you've got these prairie soils through here, and you can see, hopefully it comes up here in just a second. You can see, right, how the soils formed in Texas, right? So the Gulf of Mexico used to be at the doorstep of San Antonio, right at the hill country, the very, very beginning. And then it slowly receded back, right, as over time. And so the soils formed slowly over time during the along that coastal prairie. You can see as it went down. And you can kind of see these different soils that formed up here. If you go look over here at West Texas, you can see that number 3. Well, that's where the mountains are, right? Well, you go up to the Panhandle and you know, close to the Big Bend region, it's a lot more sandy soil. And then the further away you get more clayey soil, and that's because the sand only traveled so far because the winds came up from the south, from Mexico, and they blew it up towards the Panhandle. So so you get this interesting dynamic where the soils change as you go north from the Panhandle, and you get the soils changing as you go southeast from Dallas, Fort Worth, San Antonio, as that Gulf Coast went receded back into the Gulf of Mexico. And you can see these dominant soil orders here. You can see, you know, these prairie soils, see how they're formed. And then I am missing a slide. Well, so if I went through this and I don't know what happened to my slide, but if you look at the natural different native areas of Texas and the different land classifications that Texas Parks and Wildlife give, and you laid it over the map, you can tell that it follows the map. These different trees and the different soils, they fall right on top of each other. And so you'll see that as you go further south, that it changes into you know, the different natural areas of Texas, Gulf Coast prairies, from the hill country. Of course, you got the West Texas mountains and everything, and it overlays really nicely. You can see, well, is one the product of the soil, or is the soil the product of the natural biological areas? Well, the answer is yes, they formed together. The plants adapted as that soil changed, and the soil changed as the plants adapted. You know, that's why we get the lost pines, right? That's why we have some plants that have adapted, but they're naturally an Arctic plant. And my example of that is the Osage orange, the bodark tree. It is naturally a Arctic plant, but is adapted for our native hot environments. It held on when all the other plants that couldn't take the cold going away died. It was able to handle the warmth. So you get some plants that stick around and some plants that can't handle it. And so, as you can see, well, one of the things that, my kind of the last thing, and I'll gladly open it up to questions here in a second, because I, just want to give the last 15 minutes to questions. How does one study a soil? What can you find out from your soil? If you're looking at this one, right, what can I find out by digging a hole? I find that the rock's about 6 to 12 inches underneath it. I can see this undulation here, right? Now, you probably don't have the ability to cut in the side of a wall like TXDOT here did in this situation, but you can see how deep those roots are going. You can see when the soil gets less dark. You can do that by digging a hole, right? So dig a hole and you send it to Texas A&M Soil Conservation and Soil Laboratory. See my old professor. Actually, he retired. And you can find out, what its texture is. But you can also just see, how many earthworms did I find? Was it easy to dig? Was it difficult to dig? When I was digging, did the soil come off in clods? Or was it just one massive structure? If I dug in the winter time and it was very wet, it's a good idea to dig when it's drier and see, if that was much harder. Well, it's harder for a tree to get its roots through that as well. How much earthworm casts do I have? How many insects do I have? And then, of course, what color do I have? Fun fact about the Munsell color charge: Munsell was a paint company. And all of these federal government workers kept taking all of their paint sampling things, and they figured out, must have asked them, what are you using this for? Well, they were using it to classify their soils. So they started making these soil color charts for them, because they were actually using it as their comparison for the different soils, by taking the paint sampling pages. So here, an excellent example of, native versus disturbed soils. I'm in an urban environment right now, and I'm in an urban environment, and I'm an inspector of urban environments. So I see lots of soil changes, lots of different soils that have gone through much variability through time, through the city of Austin or whatever it may be. And you see this often in the city of Austin, or you'll see it in San Antonio too, where you get a mix of soils, right? And they may not have put down the same texture that was there originally. And it's hard to manage for what you have there. It kind of goes back to, well, the soil health, soil that you have is the soil that you want to make healthy, right? It's a lot easier to manage what you have. And so keeping grass on it with diverse grass, you can get productivity out of that. You can get native grasses to grow. There are soil apps. The one that I like to use is Soil Web. And so like Soil Web, you download it and it says get soil data, and it'll say urban soil here, and it'll say Houston Black, which is the one I warned you against, but I rent, so it's not a problem to me. So Houston Black, which is that shrink swell soil, very common in Austin. So, and you can find more information in Soil Web. You can also, these books are very good. I like Tales from the Underground. It's pretty interesting, especially when he talks about prairie dogs and everything. And there's there's lots of macro vertebrates that exist that change our soils, from deer, of course, to, we have rats, unfortunately, but you know, there are good ones as well. And it would be great if we had more prairie dogs still back in these areas, but unfortunately we don't. Um, so this, you know, it's many may know Aldo Leopold, but he says land is not merely soil as a foundation of energy flowing through circuits of soil, plants, and animals. And it's true, you know, the plants bring down the sugars into the soil, and the soils provide the organic matter, and you know, the plants provide the organic matter, but also it's stored in the soil and it's released, and then the non-organic nutrients are released, like calcium and potassium, through time, and they're cycled, and the nitrogen comes from lightning of all things, you know. And in a diverse ecosystem, you know, it starts small, right? You have one Giardia plant growing in an area where there wasn't. Well, now you're adding nutrients to that maybe 2 inches of soil, and you've got a bee comes to it, you know, and all those things, they build on each other as with time. One thing I'll add, you know, I was a vegetation specialist for the state of Texas, and if you're looking to grow native grasses and you're looking to get them established, and you want the most bang for your buck, forget about bluebonnets because they're expensive. Giardia, Rudbeckia, Prairie Verbena, primrose, the evening primrose, and Canadian, Canada wild. What am I trying? I'm blanking on this plant. And there's a Canada wild, right? Is that what I'm trying to think of? Anyways, you can get the evening primrose to grow on a rock. You can get Giardia to grow on a rock. And so if you're looking for establishment, those two are really great. Rudbeckias are the same thing. They just will grow really, really easily. All right, so that's what I have. I'm happy. I'm going to stop this presentation so I can see you guys. Close and zoom and stop sharing. Stop sharing, and I will happily answer questions, especially while I Google that plant that I'm trying to remember.
It looks like some folks have already put some questions in the chat.
Yeah, let me bring up the chat. Okay. Chat, 5 questions. All right. How are weed sedge and mesquite important for soils? Well, they do a few things. One, they are legumes. So if they're not 100% of the, you know, if they're not overgrown and, you know, all in moderation, right? They are a legume. And so they do provide that nitrogen cycling into the soil. They are also, they're native. They're not perfectly native, as we say. You know, they're kind of indicative of a little bit of a degraded environment. But if you think of it as they're early successors. So they're providing nutrients into the soil. They're breaking up compaction because their big roots are able to do that. And they're able to provide a stabilizing force for other plants. You know, if you go South Texas and you go to any mesquite tree, you'll almost always find those dewberries at the bottom, right? So they're an important source for, you know, they are in moderation a very good plant to have because they are able to provide nutrient cycling. They are able to provide some food for deer that like to browse on them early in the spring. And they, like I said, provide a place for our, our flora to kind of survive. But like if you have 100% mesquite cover, that's not good for an ecosystem. What soil properties changes would one expect to see where row crop farmland is restored to native prairie? First thing you will see is you'll start to see the A horizons start to form again, which means you'll have an increased organic matter. So if they're using conventional farming, that's a lot of tillage. That means you lose the microbes immediately. That's why people say, "Oh, this land is farmed out." That's what they used to say. We replaced that with process with fertilizer, but you're still 80% of all of your nutrients, even in the best, most fertilized place in the world. 80% of all your nutrients come from organic matter in the soil. So what happens when you restore a farmland to a native prairie? You get better diversity in the soil. You'll see a lot more earthworms. You'll see a lot more plants, of course, coming in, but you'll see a lot more wildlife, and you'll see a lot more organic matter. All of that is the nature of adding that organic matter into the soil. I also want to say too, though, if you're to do that, you want to check the compaction, because compaction doesn't just miraculously go away. And if you find compaction, 6 inches below, because they plow up the first 6 inches, but the compaction might be going down to 12 inches, you might need to actually break up that compaction layer to get those plants to put their roots below that 12 inches or below that compaction layer, because they can hit the compaction layer and just go to the other direction, and they just can't get through it at a certain point. What microbes, if any, were depleted during a century of farming that is not now available to support a healthy prairie restoration? Most of them. So in a native prairie situation, most of it is bacteria in a grassland, and most of it is dominated by fungus in a tree forest environment. Neither is bad. That's just how the ecosystem tends to work. And a grassland is dominated by bacteria. And so you basically lose the general population. You may lose, some may be extinct, I don't know. But you lose just the numbers, it just goes down. If it was 5% of a soil, it goes down to 1%. And that's a huge change. Are gophers helpful? Yes. They aerate the soil. They cycle nutrients and take it from the top to take it to the bottom, and vice versa. And so they're actually incredibly helpful for a soil, and they aerate a soil, and they have a very, very important role in soil nutrient cycling. Okay. Any comments on the whole? We have only X number of harvests left. So and what about the notion of soil versus dirt? Dirt is what you sweep up in your house, and soil is soil is the medium in which life exists. So what is, a lot of people say, well, that's dirt because look, there's no grass there. Well, something's living there, right? I've got a big area over here. It's not mine, but it's a big patch of no grass, and I haven't gotten any grass to grow in it. But I wouldn't call it dirt because it's still a medium in which life is existing. Basically, dirt is misplaced soil. That's what it comes down to. That's the difference. That's the technical difference of what the two are. How is nitrogen? Why is nitrogen important to plants? It's important to all of us, actually, but it's what proteins are made out of, is basically what it comes down to. All proteins have nitrogen, and so you need nitrogen to build your proteins. And of course, proteins are what you build the cell walls out of, be you human or plant. And so they use that for their cell walls. It builds the structure. The protein's portion of the structure component of a plant. And so that's why it's so important. It's the nutrient that's in the highest need by the plant. So that's why in a fertilizer bag, even your organic fertilizer bag, it's the first number in there because it's the one that's in the highest need by the plant. And then phosphorus and potassium. Most of our soils have enough potassium in San Antonio area, but not all. What would be the best and second best things to add to a soil to improve it the most if you're able to add something? Some sort of organic matter, so compost, a compost or some sort of compost organic matter that you have. You know, you know, I'm not going to push any products or anything, but when it comes down to the compost and other things will add long-term nutrients over time. So they won't be immediately available. Like in my garden, I ended up having to add some organic nitrogen sources because it wasn't quickly available. The compost doesn't break down as fast, but long term, if you're growing native plants, long term the compost will add it in time. But native plants don't need the nutrients added as much. I do argue against a lot of people who say that, oh, you don't need to add any nutrients. Actually, often you will get much better results if you do add some nutrients in the situation. Prairie Dog is kind of the same thing as the gopher. They help aerate the soil. They form these tunnels. You know, when the prairie dog goes away, those tunnels are available. That soil is more aerated. It's kind of what we're mimicking when we plow the prairie with that aeration, allowing infiltration to happen. And so that's the big thing too. The aeration, those holes allow infiltration. Another thing that adds great infiltration is deep plant roots. Plants will catch that soil or catch that water. They funnel it to their roots because they want to get as much as they can. And so they come, you know, they kind of, that's why they're formed like this, right? They look like a tree looks. They're trying to get all of the water to come to their roots. And that actually helps it infiltrate into the soils as well. And prairie dogs kind of just do that same thing. All right, so if mollisols are the typical prairie soil, why do we have mainly alpha soils and vertisols in the coastal Fayette prairies? Great question, and you got technical, love it. All right, mollisols are a typical prairie soil, but not all prairies are made of mollisols. Mollisols are comprised of what's called a mollic layer, which is a dark coloration of that soil. So that can be a product of both the parent material and the microbial activity that exists in that soil. In the coastal and Fayette prairies, often we have really, really sandy soils. When you don't have a sandy soil, typically you have that vertisol, right? So when you have a sandy soil, it's hard to get a dark mollic horizon because it's hard to hold on to that water enough because it's so sandy to hold on to enough of that bacteria to get a dark horizon and hold on to those nutrients. There's so much oxygen moving around in that soil, even though, like I said, it has less air theoretically than a clay, the diffusion of that air is less. The air can go in and out much easier. And so the bacteria are much more active. And so they break down the organic matter fast. And that's why we get a lot of alphasols. Besides that, we're often along the coastal region, get a little bit more rainfall if we're in the eastern side, maybe heavier rainfall if we're talking a hurricane or something. That moves nutrients through the soil as well. It leaches them out. Many ways nutrients get removed. Get removed when we remove the plants, removed into the air, and they can also be lost by leaching, by water forcing them down the soil profile. Vertisols. So now you don't have the sandy capability as much, right? you've got this clay soil. Vertisols are a product of their parent material. Their parent material absorbs water quickly. Sodium is what often does it. It's the space in between the clays that absorbs this water. Sodium can absorb 8 water molecules about each sodium molecule. Where do we get the sodium from? Like I said, that was where the Gulf of Mexico was. So a lot of that clay held on to some of that sodium. It got embedded into those clay structures. And so you see it loses all this water in the summertime. You get these big, huge cracks. And then it when it rains like crazy, and all the water goes through those cracks, and it has crazy great infiltration rate. It's going, and then all it swells up and it seals up, and there's no infiltration at all. All of the water runs off at that point. And that's why you see those coastal Houston black soils, sometimes they can absorb massive amounts of water until they stop absorbing water. And then that water runs off quickly. And that's what's so important about having a native prairie, having a tall grass in those situations with those vertisols, is it absorbs even more water. If you have 6 foot tall grass, it's going to absorb a lot more water than 2-inch, because the soil is only going to do what it's going to do. But think of how much water gets just captured by the plant and gets carried through by the plant in its roots. Because once it seals, and it's not going to let up until it's dried out again. But vertisol means invert. It's moving in and out. And so when that is coming, it goes into the cracks, right? And that soil goes into the cracks, and then it shrinks or it swells up, and those swells actually move it in and out. And that's why it's a vertisol. It inverts. Eventually the soil that's on the bottom will get pushed up in the top. And this is why your house gets cracks, because the soil literally shrinks and swells and moves in and out. And that's all a product of how those soils formed. We get out, like I said, alpha soils mostly because you got sandier soils. Usually you're not able to get those molic horizons established as much. And the vertisols, because you have the clay soils, part of the parent material, and they're bigger. They form and they're just what's naturally there. I love vertisols, by the way. They're the most fascinating of all of our soils. I'd be happy to do this again. By the way, there was something else I was going to say. I cannot remember what it was, but if I want to defend vertisols a little bit too, because they shrink and they swell, but they're a very important soil for our ecosystem. That was what I was going to say. So sometimes you can also get a soil that's really close to another one. It has one property of another, but it just isn't enough to be classified as the other. That Eccrine Clay that I keep mentioning, that's all over the northern hill country. That soil is very shrink swelly, but it isn't enough to be considered a vertisol. So it's still a mollisol. So like I said, you can see it in my parents' house. Often there'll be these big cracks because it does have some of those clays that shrink and swell, but there's like any engineer would have, there's a certain amount that it has to shrink enough to be considered an actual vert. So it's a vertic mollisol. So kind of interesting. Again, I'm trying to find that plant that I was blanking on.
I had a question.
Mm-hmm.
So on the map, I noticed that there's a kind of a little blob that mollisol south, maybe east, sort of San Antonio. Can you describe where that area might be?
Yes, let me bring it up. Going to my site. I went too far. Here.
Yeah, that one.
Yeah, the little
That one.
yeah, that little green blob of mollisol down there. Can you describe maybe where that is?
Sure. So that is, there's a band of soil. You can see these vertisols that run. What that is right there is, and I'm not exactly sure which soils form there, but that's, if you think about it, that's a very productive area of the state of Texas right there. That's where a lot of our cottonland is growing. That's where we have a lot of native prairies in those areas. So that mollisol there, what happened there, I'm sure, is that we had the right mixture of limestone soils and lots of, if I go back to this one, we can actually probably get this. So it's 31. It's Montel, looks like it's a Montel Catarina soil. It's Rio Grande Prairie. It's really just probably a soil that, over here in this eastern section, it still has a lot of that sodium clays, sodic clays from the ocean still in it. And this area has been washed out a little bit more. There's more rainfall that has occurred. And so it's washed out those clays. And so you get less of that vertisol effect, and you get a deeper soil that has occurred in those areas. It's really just a matter of where you get lucky, I guess is the way of saying. The texture's right, and there's nothing wrong. Don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with the soil that's an alpha sol, an intasol. They all can support their plants and their ecosystems. The mollisol is just going to give you your best success typically, and that's what I tell people. It's going to give you the most amount of diversity for plants. But if you want to grow pine trees and the mixed hardwoods in Bastrop, you're going to be very successful at that too, because they are great for growing that stuff in those areas. So it's a matter of knowing what plants to plant where you're at, right? But that was a great question, to which I don't feel like I had a great answer to, but
Does anybody else have any questions, or nobody else? Let's see who we got. All right.
Well, guys, thank you for asking me to come. I really appreciate it. I wish I could remember the name of that plant off the top of my head, but gosh,
is it Canadian wild rye?
Well, Canadian wild rye is one of them. Yes, absolutely. That will take off and do well. But it's not one that will do, I will also say this: if you plant little grama, that one will do well as well. Little blue stem, sorry, and blue grama, those are great plants. Blue grama, little blue stem. Little blue stem can establish really well in a lot of areas too.
There's also, I'm sorry, there's also a Texas bluegrass that I had. It's grows in more shady areas, and it looks very similar to a Canadian wild rye, in that it's got like a wheat like structure at the top, and it's like blue. I don't know the genus and species.
I think it may be blue grama.
Blue grama.
But I'm not sure.
Yeah. Alrighty, folks. Well, thank you very much. It was a great presentation. I learned some stuff here. I know everybody else had learned some fabulous stuff. Does anybody have a last call for questions? Does anybody else have any questions? All right. Okay. I think we're good. Y'all have a wonderful evening, and y'all will see us again next, whenever the next meeting is, whatever Tuesday it falls on. So, all righty, guys. Thank you very much for presenting, Mr. Jacob. Y'all have
You're
a wonderful
welcome.
evening.
You too. Bye.